Hello, everyone. My name is Evie Martin. I'm the lead pastor here at Flatwoods Church. Welcome to worship online with us today. We are just a few weeks out from the beginning of hurricane season in the Atlantic. And for many of us living in North or Central America, we can mark time by the big hurricanes of our lifetimes. As a child, names like Hugo and Andrew felt strangely like people I should be friends with, and yet they didn't seem very friendly. The trifecta of Dennis, Katrina, and Rita slammed the Gulf Coast the year that I started seminary. Ike had me worried about my brother, who was living in Houston at the time, but Ike was nothing compared to Harvey just a few years ago. And Maria came not too long after, the first hurricane I had the opportunity to respond to with willing hands and power tools. In the summer of 2018, I visited the small island of Vieques in Puerto Rico, nearly a year after Maria had all but wiped it out. Ironically, that trip was my first introduction to Flatwoods Church, 2 years before I would become your pastor, because one of your church members was a part of our group. We were there to work with the Methodist Church in Puerto Rico as they were setting up the infrastructure for groups from churches to come and help them rebuild and restore so much that was destroyed. We arrived nearly a year after Maria had hit. The whole island, home to 3,000 people, was still without power. They were running off FEMA generators. The church's roof was still open to the elements, and it took the next 20 groups from Missouri churches working alongside the community to get it replaced. The hospital was still shut down. Anyone needing medical attention faced an hour-long ferry ride to the Big Island, and that ferry only ran twice a day. That was in 2018. It's 2022, and that hospital still isn't open. After too many preventable deaths, residents began bringing cinder blocks to the main plaza as a memorial and a protest, showing that if the government won't rebuild it, they'll bring the bricks themselves. Hurricanes have been around longer than we have, but in our collective lifetime, we've observed the shift in their magnitude and their destruction. We now know that's a direct result of our human impact on the climate. Our carbon emissions over the last century and a half have raised the temperature of the atmosphere to a level that creates more violent and volatile storms. Last week, we talked extensively about the human impact that we've had on planet Earth and how our relationship to the earth directly correlates to our relationship with God. As the caretakers of this home that God has invited us into. And today we're going to talk about how that same relationship with our earth has an impact on our neighbors. And as you probably already know, that impact is a disproportionate one. Those who have historically done the most damage and who continue to contribute the most to climate change are not the ones who will suffer the most from it. The single highest correlating factor to carbon emissions is wealth. Over the last 150 years, the United States, the UK, the EU, and now China have pumped the most carbon dioxide into the atmosphere by well over 50%. When you take population into account, we, as Americans, are the highest individual emitters. We average 16 tons of carbon dioxide per person every year. The global average is 5 tons per person per year. But as we watch disasters unfold around the world, we have to be willfully ignorant not to notice who is most affected. The people of Africa and Asia bear the brunt of extreme weather events, flooding, and droughts. Impoverished places already lack the infrastructure and education and resources to meet daily needs, and then there's no safety net or meaningful government support for recovery or for protection against future problems. Take, for example, Miami Beach, where they are pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into raising streets and installing pumps to prepare for future flooding from rising sea levels. While just 700 miles away, Port-au-Prince, Haiti, has no such capacity or hope to protect her people from the same danger. The effects of climate change and the suffering it brings will be borne first and most heavily in the lives of the poor. It's already happening. This is a problem for humanity as a whole, but it's especially a problem for anyone who calls themselves a Christian. This reality of disproportionate harm comes into direct opposition with two central mandates of our faith. First of all, our biblical story introduces us to a God whose heart is for the poor, to the point that that very God became human like us, not with wealth and power, but in poverty and with love. God's charge to us and how we should then live in this world is with generosity and care for the poor. This care is what was meant to set the people of Israel apart in the Old Testament. We hear in Proverbs, "Do not exploit the poor because they are poor, and do not crush the needy in court. The Lord will take up their case and press the life out of those who oppress them." Just because people are poor does not give anyone any right to take advantage of them, either willfully or ignorantly. The Lord has some strong feelings about those who do. The words of the Lord from the prophet Isaiah aren't any less harsh. "Doom to those who pronounce wicked decrees and keep writing harmful laws to deprive the needy of their rights and to rob the poor among my people of justice. To make widows their loot, to steal from orphans. What will you do on the day of punishment when disaster comes from far away? To whom will you flee for help? Where will you stash your wealth?" I believe the implied answer to that rhetorical question is nowhere. There will be no help, no security for those who deprive the poor of their rights and their justice. The Lord is pretty clear. The people of Israel were called from the beginning to be a different kind of people who valued and cared for the things and the people that the rest of the world seemed to discard. That same identity holds true for the church in the New Testament. We see in Jesus himself and in the company he keeps that all people, especially the poor, are deeply loved by God. In 1 John, the fallout for Jesus' followers who fail to care holds echoes of those Old Testament warnings. "But if someone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but refuses to help, how can the love of God dwell in a person like that?" So as we consider our modern problem of climate change and its disproportionate impact on those in poverty, we as Christians are called to reckon. We enter into the conversation of what is now widely known as climate justice. The second mandate of our faith, where climate justice challenges us as wealthy nation citizens, is the command to love our neighbors. It's much easier to wrestle with loving the neighbors I can see, even if they are hard to love. I can make the direct one-to-one connection between my actions, my heart, and their experience of me. It's harder to feel the truth of our interconnectedness worldwide. There's not a visible thread from me turning on my air conditioner directly tied to a child in sub-Saharan Africa walking 4 extra miles to her water source in a season of prolonged drought. But the connectedness is real. My carbon footprint, ours, our nation's, is threaded to so much suffering throughout the world. I don't believe this is love of neighbor. World Vision, a faith-based organization that has been tirelessly working to eradicate poverty throughout the world since 1950, has faced significant challenges in these last few decades as they see the unfolding impact of climate change on those living in poverty. They explain that 75% of the world's poor live in rural areas where they rely on forests, lakes, or the ocean for their livelihood. Well, what are the ecosystems that climate change affects? Forest, lakes, oceans. As these resources are depleted or contaminated, droughts and floods set in. Food sources diminish. If you can picture such a world, you know that malnutrition comes next, along with diseases like malaria and even diarrhea that are especially deadly for children. Eventually, already, people will begin to migrate. We've talked a lot about refugees here at Platt Woods Church over the last year. We work with 2 Afghan families right now, making a safe and welcoming home for them here in Kansas City after they resettle from evacuating Afghanistan. The world has long been creating refugees from situations of war and violence, but now we are creating climate refugees. People fleeing their homelands because the earth itself no longer gives life there. I'm curious what our personal and national stance will be on welcoming those we have effectively run out of their homes with our carbon emissions. Most of the first people so dramatically impacted by climate change are going to be in Africa, in Asia, in South America. And if you don't know people or places in those parts of the world, it can be hard to care. I get it. We're supposed to, at some high moral level we do, but it can be hard to change our own habits and consumption for people living in poverty 10,000 miles away. Take note, though, climate change doesn't just disproportionately affect the poor in faraway places. The very same is true right here in the U.S. Let's take Hurricane Katrina, for example. That was probably the biggest wake-up call to Americans about the disparity in our own systems of aid and relief. There we were, the most powerful and wealthy nation on earth, and we couldn't get people out of harm's way. Well, we couldn't get the poor people out. And in the United States, economic status and skin color all too often go hand in hand, thanks to our long history of systemic racism. So after one of the most catastrophic hurricanes on record, we created our own climate refugees as poorer people migrated away from New Orleans to rebuild their lives somewhere else, where nature was not another variable they'd have to account for in day-to-day survival. I do remember a particular church's response after Katrina, one that gave me hope then, and that grounds me even now in what healthy churches ought to look like. I had just started seminary when Katrina hit. We were trying out different churches each week, trying to find a place to land. We had visited the big, fancy Methodist church, the one with endowments and with a multi-million-dollar budget, the fancy sanctuary, and amazing music program. We liked it a lot. But then, the Sunday after Katrina, we visited a much smaller Methodist church, a less fancy sanctuary, quirky but delightful people, and a strange churchy smell in the foyer. The pastor seemed a little edgy and kind of a loose cannon, and we weren't sure if that was good or bad yet. As worship began that day, I expected a hymn or a prayer to follow the choir's opening song. Instead, Jody, the pastor, got up and said, "Okay, people, there are families coming to Atlanta from New Orleans this week. They've got apartments ready to take them. We need to get them the things that they need." And then he pulled out a checklist and started rattling off. "All right, I need 5 sets of silverware. Who can bring me silverware? Taylor's, Moore's, Pursley's? Okay, got it. All right, towels. We need 15 sets of towels. Who can I put down? What about sheets? And we're going to need toys for kids." It went on until every need was accounted for. And then we sang the opening hymn. I suspect you know which church we ended up at. Hurricane Katrina was 13 years ago. But the disparity problem hasn't gotten any better. I began this sermon with a story about Vieques in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And as I said, the hospital there still is not open. May I remind you that Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. Those who live in Vieques are among the poorest, but they are citizens of the richest nation on earth. And they have had no hospital for 4 years. Such a story would not unfold in Houston or Florida or North Carolina. Even Puerto Rico or Katrina may seem distant across space or time, but we can bring this conversation right into our own backyard. Do you know that in cities across the nation, poorer urban communities and neighborhoods of color are categorically hotter than white suburban communities? It is measurable, there is a pattern, it is real, and it has a name: urban heat islands. An urban heat island is an area where the expanse and the color of concrete and the lack of tree canopy contributes to the entrapment of heat during the summer months. And it can raise the temperature as much as 10 to 13 degrees above the actual temperature. And it stays hot, even after the sun goes down. And that matters because folks who live in these areas have a much higher risk of heat exhaustion, heat stroke, dehydration, which leads to liver and kidney problems, and low blood pressure. Would you be surprised to know that Kansas City ranks number 7 out of the 60 worst urban heat islands in the United States? Would you be surprised to know that Kansas City has some of the highest utility bills relative to income in the country? We have a 31% tree canopy coverage here in Kansas City. The American Forest Association recommends 40%, and it's declining every year. That means that we would need to plant 27,000 more trees every year for decades to even make a dent. The city doesn't have the funds to do that. And who will pay the consequences? Those who can't afford high, inefficient utility bills. The poorest of our urban communities will suffer the most, especially as we roll into the summer months ahead. Residents will not have shade to cool their homes, yards, or sidewalks. Evenings will remain hot as concrete absorbs and then radiates the heat of the day. Landlords who do not maintain energy-efficient homes will house people who then have to choose between groceries and paying high utility bills. Right here in Kansas City, our neighbors. Our relationship with our planet is directly linked to our love of our neighbors. It's all connected. So what steps can we take? In the conversations of climate justice, injustice seems to abound, and it feels impossible to overcome. But for Christians, the size of the problem has never really been a good enough excuse to not do anything. When the command is love your neighbor and care for the poor, I'm not sure God is very interested in all our reasons why we cannot obey. There are a few ways we can respond and maybe even one day prevent the suffering of our neighbors as a result of climate change. For starters, we can educate ourselves. Learn about what life is like for our neighbors living in poverty. Find out where the urban heat islands are right here in Kansas City. What neighborhoods are devoid of trees? Where will it be unbearably hot this summer? And then we can get involved, find out who's already working to address climate injustice in our community. Bridging the Gap is a local organization already hard at work, trying to move our community toward greater energy efficiency and increased tree canopy. You can check out our Walk Lightly resource page on our website to see how you can have them come and do a free energy assessment on your own home to learn. They'll help you conserve, they'll help you make your life more energy efficient. Or you can sign up on our website to plant trees with Platt Woods Church next Saturday. You can plant trees anytime you want. The world needs trillions of them. Another step we can take is to pick up the cost. One of the biggest obstacles to clean and affordable energy or toward a zero-waste lifestyle is that right now it is just more expensive. As just a small example, LED light bulbs for your home are still sometimes twice as expensive as halogen. And for many people, the difference between $6 and $3 is no big deal. For those of us for whom that might be true, we need to spend the $6. Because for so many others, especially those in poverty, that cost difference is impossible to absorb. So those who can need to pick up the cost until the market demand drives the prices down for everyone. Yes, my zero-waste toothpaste and deodorant are more expensive than Crest and Dove, but I will make them work in my budget because I can, so that soon they might become the affordable option for everyone. The same is true of all sorts of alternative and renewable energy. If we're going to move faster towards sustainability, which we have to do, those who can afford it, those with the luxury of choice, carry the burden of change. This means we also begin working carbon dioxide offsets into our budgets. If we can't quickly and dramatically lower our carbon emissions, we have to start paying for it. Many industries already, like airlines, shipping companies, have systems in place for this, where our carbon offset assures that trees are planted or mangrove forests are restored or something to counter the emission that we've chosen to make. It's far from a perfect system, but we are Americans. Money talks. It causes us to change our behavior if it's money that we don't want to be spending. Which leads to a third step we can take. We can change our patterns. This is hard because it means we make sacrifices. At the Royals game this week, I overheard someone talking about how we are just a couple of generations away from people having to make real sacrifices in the way they live. I'm afraid there are no couple of generations. That time is here now. It's our generations that need to curb our insatiable appetites. We can, and it will make a difference. If we sacrificed cows, that's biblical even. If we just gave up or reduced our red meat consumption, we would slash the methane emissions from cattle, which accounts for 14.5% of all greenhouse gas. We can change our energy consumption if we just pay more attention. Keep lights off more. Let your house be a little warmer this summer, a little cooler in the winter. Consolidate your errands. Try to drive less. Walk more. Carpool. Advocate for more extensive public transportation. Use less water. If you have to let the tap run while the water gets warm, which I do from time to time, capture it to water your plants. Take short showers. Don't run your sprinklers. I know, the horror. These things may seem difficult. That is the nature of sacrifice. Something we think we need, but really we just want, can be hard to let go of. But when you remember that it is connected to another human's suffering, somewhere in our city, in our nation, in our world, it becomes easier to simplify and walk more lightly. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells a parable in which the master of a house leaves for a time, entrusting his servants and his household with his home while he is away. It's not a parable that turns out well for most of those who had been given responsibility to look after the master's possessions. They didn't do a great job, and they end up paying the consequences. And Jesus ends the story with this verse. From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. And from the one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded. The burden of responsibility, the onus of the change that is needed for our earth, the weight of the sacrifices that need to be made, fall to those who have been given much. Even more will be demanded of us in the years to come. How we choose to walk this earth now speaks of our love for God and for what God has entrusted to us. And when we walk lightly, learn from those who suffer and sacrifice for their sake, it is an act of obedience to God's greatest command, to love our neighbor. Will you pray with me these words from Pope Francis' prayer for our earth? All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen.